April 28, 1945. This was the day the promise of a new Roman Empire ended in a muddy ditch. Benito Mussolini promised to restore Italy's pride. Instead, he led the nation into a total disaster. By the final days of the war, the state had collapsed. Italy took justice into its own hands. Mussolini's power was gone. What followed was not a quiet surrender or a hidden trial. It was a public execution. The world would never forget the images from that day. How did a journalist become a dictator? The answer lies in the ruins of the Great War. Benito Mussolini rose to power in the early 1920s. At that time, Italy was drowning in chaos. The First World War had left deep, permanent scars on the economy. Soldiers returned from the front lines to find only unemployment and record-high inflation. The government offered nothing but empty promises. The people were angry. They wanted a shift in the status quo. Mussolini used this frustration to his advantage. He stopped writing articles and started organizing militias. He called himself Il Duce. This translates to the leader. He promised to make Italy a global power once again. Millions of Italians chose to believe him. October 1922. Mussolini organized the March on Rome. This was his gamble for total control. Thousands of followers wearing black shirts filled the streets of the capital. These were the fascists. They were armed and aggressive. The weak government in Rome froze. No one gave the order to fire. King Victor Emmanuel III watched the crowds from the palace. He handed power to Mussolini, hoping the move would bring stability. At first, the plan worked. The footage from this era shows a different Italy. Trains ran on time. The streets were cleared of strikers and criminals. Mussolini ordered the construction of grand marble buildings and massive sports complexes. He stood on balconies and gave fiery speeches to massive crowds. But this was only the beginning of the trap. Behind the scenes, the control was absolute. Mussolini seized the media. He redirected the curriculum in every school. He even attempted to control the private thoughts of the citizens. There was no room for dissent. Italy had a new master, and the price of stability was total obedience. Events accelerated. The facade of order began to crack. Mussolini wanted more than just safe streets. He wanted war. 1930. Benito Mussolini demanded more than just Italy. He craved the status of a god. He envisioned a new Roman Empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the Horn of Africa. Power was not enough. He wanted the world to tremble at the mention of Rome. Mussolini believed war was the only way to earn respect. He viewed peace as a sign of weakness, but this ambition would lead to a slaughter. October 3, 1935. Hundreds of thousands of Italian troops crossed the border into Ethiopia. It was one of the last independent nations on the continent. Mussolini promised a swift, clean victory. The reality was a bloodbath. The footage from the front lines shows the scale of the horror. Italian bombers circled the sky. They didn't just target soldiers, they targeted thatched roofs and mud huts. The pilots dropped canisters of mustard gas. The chemical burned the skin and lungs of everyone it touched. Poison gas was a war crime. International laws strictly forbade its use. Mussolini ignored the treaties. Thousands of Ethiopians died in agony. Women and children were caught in the clouds of toxic vapor. The sound of screams filled the valleys. Emperor Haile Selassie realized his army could not fight gas with spears. He fled into exile. He stood before the League of Nations and asked for help. The League took action. They officially condemned the invasion. They imposed economic sanctions to starve the Italian military. It was a formal gesture, but it lacked teeth. One critical resource remained untouched: oil. The League refused to ban petroleum shipments. Without a fuel embargo, Mussolini's tanks and planes never stopped moving. Secret trade deals continued behind closed doors. Many nations prioritized profit over the lives of Ethiopians. Italy's war machine kept grinding forward. By May 1936, the war was over. Mussolini stood on his balcony and declared victory. He felt invincible. But the cost was hidden in the numbers. Italy was now an international pariah. The sanctions failed to stop the war, but they succeeded in isolating the regime. Major powers began to view the Duce as a loose cannon. The victory was hollow. Italy was alone. Events accelerated toward a much larger catastrophe. 1936. Benito Mussolini moved closer to Adolf Hitler. They formed a partnership that changed the map of the world. Both men admired raw strength. Both men shared a vision of total conquest and absolute control. The camera shows them standing together on balconies, overlooking massive crowds. This friendship became a legal obligation in 1939. They signed the Pact of Steel. It was a formal contract. Italy and Germany promised to support each other in any war, regardless of the cause. From that moment, Italy's future was tied to Hitler's decisions. How did Mussolini react when World War II began? He waited. He watched the borders. At first, Italy stayed neutral. Mussolini wanted to identify the winner before committing his troops. But Germany conquered much of Europe in just a few months. The speed of the Blitzkrieg changed his mind. June 10, 1940. Mussolini stepped onto the balcony and declared war on Britain and France. He believed the fight would be short and easy. He was wrong. The reality of modern warfare hit the Italian military hard. Italy's army was not prepared for a global conflict. The footage reveals the truth. Soldiers carried rifles designed for the previous century. They had little training. The tanks were thin-skinned and small. The planes were outdated models that couldn't compete with Allied fighters. In North Africa, the situation spiraled. Italian forces moved across the desert, but the British pushed them back within weeks. In Greece, Mussolini expected a fast victory. Instead, he faced a disaster. Greek troops fought back with high intensity. The Italian lines broke. Hitler had to intervene. He sent German divisions to rescue the Italian army. It was an absolute embarrassment for the Duce. The rescue showed the world that Italy was the junior partner. It was a sign of fundamental weakness. Back in Italy, life grew harder every day. 1942 changed everything. Allied planes appeared in the sky. Bombs fell on Italian cities. Factories stopped working because there was no coal. The economy collapsed. Shops had empty shelves. In the streets, families lined up for hours. They waited for a single loaf of bread or a few cold potatoes. The sound of sirens became constant. Soldiers returned from the front in rags, begging for food and warm clothes. But Mussolini refused to face the facts. The proud empire he promised was broken and hopeless. In the frame, he still stands at the podium. He spoke of coming victories. He gave speeches about Roman greatness while his people starved. The summer of 1943 arrived. His world was falling apart. There was no turning back. 160,000 troops. That was the scale of the Allied invasion. British, American, and Canadian soldiers hit the Italian beaches in massive numbers. The Italian army offered little resistance. Soldiers were exhausted. Supplies were non-existent. Rifles jammed and fuel ran dry. In just 38 days, Sicily fell. The defeat triggered a national collapse. Allied bombers appeared over Rome. The sound of air raid sirens became constant. Smoke rose from the capital. Panic spread through the government offices and into the ranks of the fascist party itself. The footage from the time shows the chaos. Soldiers threw down their weapons. Civilians packed suitcases and fled into the countryside. Cities turned into rubble. Mussolini appeared physically broken. His face was gaunt. He could no longer manage the collapsing front lines or the crumbling economy. July 24, 1943. Mussolini summoned the fascist Grand Council to Rome. He expected total loyalty. For over 20 years, his word was law. No one dared to speak against him. But the atmosphere in the room was cold. At first glance, a routine meeting, but in reality, a coup. One by one, his own officials stood up. They did not praise him, they blamed him. They cited the mounting death toll and the ruins of Italian cities. They accused him of dragging the nation into a grave. Arguments lasted for hours into the night. Then came the vote. The result was a total shock. 19 officials voted to strip him of his power. Only 7 remained loyal. The dictator sat in silence. The system he created had finally turned its teeth on him. It was over. There was no way back. The next day, July 25th, Mussolini drove to the Villa Savoia. He went to meet King Victor Emmanuel III. He still wore his fascist uniform, but he no longer held the state. Thus ended an era of absolute rule. The third man expected support. He found none. The king spoke 2 words, "You are dismissed." Then came the order for his arrest. Guards moved in silence. They took him away. They drove him to a waiting vehicle. This was not for his protection. It was his first hour as a prisoner. The location changed constantly. One secret house followed another. Finally, the route ended at the Gran Sasso Hotel. It sat high in a remote mountain range. Escape was impossible. The altitude was thin. The rock walls were vertical. Italy exploded. The news hit the streets like a physical wave. People did not just celebrate, they acted. Crowds tore down the black fasces from public buildings. They threw portraits of Mussolini into bonfires. The smell of burning paper filled the squares. Church bells rang in every city from Rome to Milan. 21 years of dictatorship ended in a single night. For 2 decades, fear and censorship were the only laws. Now, the pressure vanished. The regime crumbled. Italians stood in the streets and breathed. But the war continued. Germany remained a massive force across the continent. They would not allow their southern ally to vanish. Adolf Hitler received the report of the arrest. His reaction was immediate. He screamed at his generals. He called the Italian king a traitor. To Hitler, this was a direct threat to the southern front. A rescue was ordered. There would be no delay. In September 1943, the mission began. Otto Skorzeny took command of the operation. He was a man who specialized in the impossible. The target was isolated. The Gran Sasso Hotel was a fortress in the clouds. Hundreds of Italian soldiers stood guard at every entrance. Skorzeny did not use the roads. He chose the air. The footage from the era shows the gliders. They were silent. They moved through the mountain peaks. 12 aircraft descended toward the hotel. Skorzeny's men landed directly on the rocky slope beside the building. The sound of the skids hitting the ground was the only warning the guards received. There was no turning back. 12 gliders landed silently on the mountain. Not a single shot was fired. German paratroopers stormed the Hotel Campo Imperatore and found Benito Mussolini. He was alive, but his appearance shocked them. He was frail, thin, and visibly confused. Within hours, a small Storch plane landed on the rocky slope, took Mussolini on board, and flew him to safety. This was the Gran Sasso Raid. History records it as one of the boldest special operations of the Second World War. But Mussolini's return was not a liberation. It was a transfer of custody. Adolf Hitler placed him in charge of a new state in northern Italy. Its official name was the Italian Social Republic. Most called it the Republic of Salo. The administration operated out of a small town on the shores of Lake Garda. Was it a real government? On paper, yes. In reality, it was a ghost state. Germany controlled the banks, the borders, and the military. Mussolini had no real power. He was a puppet on a German string. SS officers sat in the offices, making every strategic decision. Any Italian who resisted German orders faced immediate execution or deportation to labor camps. By early 1945, the end was near. The physical destruction of Italy was visible from the air. Allied troops moved north through the peninsula, capturing one city after another. American and British units advanced from the south with heavy artillery. From the east, the Soviet Red Army crushed German divisions, forcing a massive retreat toward Berlin. The Axis powers were collapsing. Mussolini's republic crumbled alongside them. Northern Italy descended into total chaos. The footage from this period shows ruined towns, cratered roads, and columns of thousands of civilians fleeing the front lines. Loyalty evaporated. Fascist leaders who once shouted Mussolini's name were now burning their uniforms. They looked for exits. Many took suitcases of gold and fled toward the Swiss border. Others surrendered to the first Allied unit they encountered. Mussolini was left isolated in his villa. In Milan, the fear died. This was Italy's industrial heart, and the streets belonged to the resistance. These groups had spent years in the shadows. Now they were organized and armed. They were the partisans. They did not wear standard uniforms or carry formal identification. They were ordinary Italians. Factory workers, farmers, and students took up rifles. The balance of power shifted. Events accelerated. Mussolini was now a man without an army. April 25, 1945. The fascist regime in Italy collapsed. The final blow did not come from a regular army, but from the streets. The resistance consisted of students and women who had lost their homes to the bombings. They gathered hunting rifles, stolen pistols, and kitchen knives. These partisans moved through the shadows of northern Italy to drive out the German occupation. By April, the German Wehrmacht was in full retreat. The partisans saw the opportunity. They issued a single order, a total uprising. How did the cities fall so quickly? At first glance, it was chaos. But in reality, it was a coordinated strike. In Milan, partisans stormed the streets. They seized government offices, occupied radio stations, and surrounded the fascist headquarters. They cut phone lines and blocked the roads. The German commanders realized the situation was lost. They ordered their trucks to head north. Fascist officials burned their documents and abandoned their desks. The uprising ignited like a fuse. Turin fell next, then Genoa. The footage shows crowds filling the squares. People climbed onto abandoned tanks. The sound of gunfire mixed with shouts of revenge. Northern Italy was no longer a war zone. It was a hunt. Mussolini remained in the town of Salo. A phone call brought the news. Milan is gone. The camera records his final moments in power. His face is pale. His hands are steady, but his eyes remain fixed on the maps. He realized the end had arrived. 600 miles away, Hitler sat in his bunker under Berlin. Both dictators were trapped. Mussolini chose to run. He did not go alone. He gathered his mistress, Clara Petacci, and a small group of personal guards. They loaded suitcases into a few black cars. A handful of loyal officials joined the convoy. The plan was simple: drive toward Switzerland. He wanted to cross the neutral border and find a flight to Spain. He believed Francisco Franco would grant him asylum. He thought he could still negotiate or rebuild his shattered image. But this was a mistake. The roads were blocked. The mountains were crawling with partisans. There was no way out. Events accelerated. Thus ended his rule. April 27, 1945. The end was visible on every road. German columns choked the mountain passes, retreating toward the north. Allied bombers circled above, striking any vehicle that moved on the open highway. Partisans held the towns. They controlled the bridges and the narrow turns. Mussolini's convoy moved at a crawl. He did not lead. He followed, blending into a group of retreating German soldiers. The dictator wore a German military overcoat. He pulled a steel helmet low over his eyes. He sat in the back of an Opel Blitz truck, surrounded by German officers. He did not speak. He stayed in the shadows of the cargo bed, hoping to pass as a common soldier. Clara Petacci sat near him. She refused to leave his side, even as the situation collapsed. The disguise failed. Near the village of Dongo on the shores of Lake Como, the 57th Garibaldi Brigade blocked the road. The partisans searched every truck. They checked every face. One fighter climbed into the transport and saw a man sitting alone, looking at the floor. The soldier looked nervous. The partisans pulled him out into the light. They stripped away the German coat. The shock was immediate. This was Benito Mussolini. For 20 years, his face had appeared on every wall in Italy. Now, he stood on the gravel road. His uniform was stained. His skin was pale. The footage of his former rallies showed a man of iron. Here, the camera would have seen only a man with shaking hands. Events accelerated. The partisans took Mussolini and Petacci to a farmhouse in Giulino di Mezzegra. It was a cold night. They were held in a small upstairs room. Outside, the guards whispered. Some argued for a legal trial. They wanted a courtroom and a judge. Others wanted blood. They remembered 2 decades of secret police and executions. To them, a trial was a luxury he had already lost. April 28, 1945. The decision was final. At 4 in the afternoon, the guards led the pair outside. Mussolini looked at the ground. He was exhausted. He could barely walk. Petacci followed him, clutching his arm, screaming that she would stay with him. They reached a stone wall next to an iron gate. There was no formal ceremony. No long speeches were recorded. The partisans raised their weapons. The sound of the bolts racking was the last thing they heard. At 4:10 p.m., the commander gave the order. A burst of gunfire hit both targets. Mussolini and Petacci fell into the dirt. The man who promised a new Roman Empire died in a ditch. There were no crowds. There were no salutes. Only the smell of cordite and the sound of birds in the trees. The bodies lay still on the cold earth. But this was only the beginning. April 29, 1945. Milan was a city of ruins and craters. On this morning, an open truck rattled through the streets. It carried the bodies of Benito Mussolini, Clara Petacci, and 5 high-ranking fascist officials. The truck drove over the same cobblestones where Mussolini's black shirts once held massive military parades. Now, the dictator lay in the back of a transport vehicle like cargo. The destination was Piazzale Loreto. The partisans chose this location for a reason. 1 year earlier, the regime had executed 15 Italian resistance fighters in this square. Their bodies were left on display to terrify the public. The citizens of Milan remembered the smell of the asphalt and the sight of the gallows. Now, the truck stopped at the exact same spot. It was a calculated act of revenge. By 8 in the morning, the square was packed. Thousands of people arrived from every district. Factory workers in grease-stained overalls, mothers holding children by the hand, soldiers who had deserted the front lines. The crowd surged toward the truck. The footage shows a chaotic sea of people. There were no police to hold them back. The violence began almost immediately. People did not just look, they acted. Men kicked the corpses. Women spat on Mussolini's face. One woman fired 5 pistol shots into the dictator's body. She screamed that they were for her 5 dead sons. The sound of boots hitting flesh filled the air. This was the physical release of 20 years of oppression. But the partisans wanted more visibility. They needed a signal that could be seen from the back of the crowd. They dragged the bodies to a Standard Oil gas station under construction. The partisans found thick meat hooks and rope. They tied the ankles of Mussolini, Petacci, and the others. Then they hoisted them upward. The bodies swung upside down from the metal girders of the roof. Blood dripped onto the pavement below. Mussolini's face was unrecognizable from the beatings. Petacci's skirt fell over her head until a civilian stepped forward to tie it shut with a bandage. The camera records the scene. 7 figures dangling against the sky. Why did they do it? It looked like a medieval execution, but for the partisans, it was a practical necessity. It proved the Duce was dead. It showed he was not a god, but a piece of meat. The crowd finally fell silent as the bodies swayed. The image changed history. Photographers snapped frames that reached London and New York within hours. The photos appeared on the front pages of every major newspaper. In Rome and small mountain villages, the news traveled by word of mouth and radio. People poured into the streets to celebrate. The war in Italy was not officially over, but the regime was gone. The bodies remained hanging until the afternoon. Eventually, Allied authorities arrived to take control of the square. They cut the ropes and loaded the remains into simple wooden coffins. The era of the Caesar was finished. May 2, 1945. The war in Italy ended. More than 20 years of violence and propaganda vanished in a single day. People flooded the streets. They tore down fascist symbols. They burned black shirts in public squares. For the first time in 2 decades, Italians spoke freely. They sang. They gathered. The fear remained, but the relief was stronger. The country was a wreck. Milan and Turin lay in ruins. Rubble blocked the roads. Smoke still rose from bombed-out factories, but the guns were silent. In Rome, King Victor Emmanuel III watched his power dissolve. He had stood beside Mussolini for years. Now, the public saw him as a traitor. He fled into exile. On June 2, 1946, Italy voted. The monarchy died. The Republic was born. It was a total reset. Mussolini was dead, but his body remained a crisis. His family begged for a burial. They feared more violence against the corpse. The authorities acted fast. They buried him in an unmarked grave near Milan. No headstone, no name. Only a few officials knew the coordinates. They wanted to prevent the site from becoming a shrine, but the plan failed. At first glance, the secret was safe, but in reality, the fascists were watching. April 1946, 1 year after the execution, the body vanished. Under the cover of night, 3 men dug up the remains. They loaded the corpse into a car and drove away. Domenico Lacisi led the group. He was a young veteran and a fascist fanatic. For him, Mussolini was a betrayed hero. He wanted to turn the stolen body into a symbol of resistance. The theft triggered a national emergency. Police mobilized across northern Italy. They raided houses and searched warehouses. Newspapers printed wild theories every morning. The dictator had disappeared for a second time. The search lasted 4 months. In August 1946, the police reached a small monastery, the Certosa di Pavia. Inside, they found the body. A monk had hidden the remains in a small crate. He claimed he didn't know the full danger of his actions. The government seized the corpse immediately. A new problem emerged. What do you do with a ghost? The authorities chose silence. They moved the body to a secret location. It stayed there for 11 years. Most government officials never knew the address. Italy spent those years rebuilding. The cities rose from the ash. Democracy took root. The dark past was supposed to stay buried. But the family never stopped asking. Rachele Mussolini, the widow, sent letter after letter. She wanted her husband back. By the mid-1950s, the political tension had cooled. The government saw an opportunity for closure. August 1957. The state returned the remains. They buried Mussolini in Predoppio. This was his birthplace, a small town in northern Italy. A proper grave was finally constructed. Today, the site is a paradox. The footage shows a quiet cemetery, but the visitors are constant. Tourists come to see the tomb of a tyrant. Historians come to document the end of an era. And every year, small groups of sympathizers arrive to salute. They still believe the old promises of greatness. Decades have passed, but the name Mussolini remains a fracture. The story ended in a grave, but the debate never stopped.